record on this computer. All right. Hi, my name's Lauren Barker. I'm here with Chad, and we're going to go over some of the new Monorepo files.
Sure, let me share my screen. Where's that at? I think that's the one I want.
Yay.
Okay, so how much to cover? I think it's mostly a technical audience going to be for this, so I'll gloss over some of the high level stuff. But
Okay.
as far as organizing things, I think that bears covering. So we have this hierarchy of epics, and especially around the monorepo stuff, which I'll get into, they need to be reorganized because the information and approach that we're taking keeps changing, like as of up to last week,
Okay.
mainly based on like what is just possible to do with a middleman and not without redesigning large portions of the site. So the top level one is this GitLab handbook improvements, and it's got lots of other things that our team does under it, like monitoring and support and pipeline performance and stuff like that. But it has this monorepo, www.gitlab.com monorepo refactor epic under it, which groups all of this stuff. And previously, we had sort of grouped that into two main parts, which is John came up with these terms, separation and isolation. So the idea was first we would separate things out, just get the files moved under the right directories for the different sites. And then we would work on splitting up the builds and other stuff. But as many of the best laid plans turn out, that's not really how it's working out. Because of things we've discussed, we've got the handbook moved down, and that was mostly in this sub epic here. And we were first planning to just move the blog by itself, but like we said, and that's the investigation that you did yesterday here into identify the existing references. There's just a lot of stuff coupled to the blog, and it's too hard, if not impossible, to try to move part of it without just moving everything that's not in the handbook and this hasn't already been moved down all at once because of shared files and shared middleman config and other things. So that prompted Jean to sort of redo it into this phased approach. And also the descriptions on these epics aren't the greatest. I've tried to update some of them, but it's they could definitely use improvement because they've gotten dated. And like this top level one is kind of also just a dumping ground for other things that I've found along the way, but haven't bothered to put in any particular epic or issue. But as far as the monorepo refactor one, the current idea is like this phase one, we're just going to finish separating things out, move all of the rest of the actual template pages down under sites marketing. And so they'll have sites handbook and sites marketing. And then in subsequent phases, maybe we'll split up the marketing into other places. You'll turn the blog into a different serving mechanism, CMS, whatever. But that will sort of mainly be owned by the marketing team and whoever else is responsible for that. At that point, it'll be separate from the handbook. So that approach and work is just as of last week that we've decided on that. And I identified a lot of things that we could clean up that's going to make not only the move easier, but also as you try to convert the blog to a different tool or something, it'll make it easier for you going forward if everything is decoupled. So that's this, that probably could be an epic, but for right now, it's captured in this mono repo refactor preliminary separation and decoupling tasks. And it sort of talks about that, like it's all captured here, pending reorganize all of this stuff. So if we look at that one, that's the stuff that I'm currently cranking through. And I actually just finished that one this morning. And this is all about trying to just make everything primarily from the CI and build perspective independent. And so the building and deploying for each part of the site is self-contained, and it could be isolated and changed and evolved in the future independent of everything else. That's sort of the main crux of all this work here. And one of the primary things that has to happen for that is we just need to not have partial build be this thing that like intimately knows about everything and builds the whole site all at once all together. And so these first set of tasks here are really about enabling us to split up the partial build into individual jobs that just build and deploy the parts of the site on their own. With me so far?
Yeah.
Okay.
Could each site have its own partial build?
Yeah, that's essentially what it's going to turn into, but
Okay.
I'm not going to call it partial build because that would be really confusing. I think I'm going to call it partial site build,
Okay.
not to be confused with the what used to be called partial build, which was the whole site.
Okay.
And like some of the things I had to do there, like what I just finished today was, well, the whole -d flag on the rsync. You remember discussing that in the past, and that was one of the big blockers. That's sort of what I got rid of today. There's a scheduled job that runs once a day that just goes and deletes all of the old stuff that has been deleted from the repo in the last day. So that sort of, it's still all one site. So that's still a monolithic deploy, but all the individual parts can just deploy their incremental parts throughout the day on demand as part of an MR independent of each other. So it's still not completely decoupled, but it's by the end of this, it'll be a much better place that's easier to reason about how we want to proceed with breaking things up yet more further. So that's an overview of the epics and how things are laid out. Essentially, like there's this monorepo one, and the handbook's mostly done. I don't even know. Delete content that should be moved to the marketing side, right? That sort of probably
Mm-hmm.
could move somewhere else. And all of the stuff that under the blog one is sort of what's not done is stuff that we're not doing it that way. Like this mostly is likely either going to turn into or be replaced with one that's like create a marketing subsite.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so that's the overview of the issues.
Awesome.
Is there any more in that, or do you want to talk code?
Yeah, let's dive into the three new files that I've seen that are going to help construct this monorepo.
Sure. So to start with some history, if you want to look at issues, there's so a few of the completed issues here under this monorepo refactor handbook one. Like the first one was like define just how all this stuff should be sorted. And you can see that this eventually got moved up this list to this top level monorepo epic here and refined a little bit more. And then there was also the parts 1 and parts 2 of the actual handbook move. So you can see this part 1 it actually started with this issue here, this middleman symlinkless file sharing, which was mostly just a lot of random stuff of me figuring out how to make middleman work in a monorepo and the approaches, partially coming up with like the monorepo YAML and the extension and the stuff like that. So this was sort of the start of it, but the actual move was captured in these part 1 and part 2. So the part 1 was just the engineering and marketing subdirectories, and you can see the stuff we moved here. In this first approach, I didn't actually move them files. I just symlinked them because I wasn't sure what would break once I really move them. Because when they're at the top level builds can still work because they're there. But once you actually move stuff out from under the top level build, who knows? Stuff might be breaking. But it went smoothly. And then by the time we went with moving the rest of the handbook, which is this part 2 here, we were more confident, and like we didn't do it with a symlink, just added the config to the config that monorepo YAML, told people we're doing it, and did it. And
Mm-hmm.
for the most part, it was a non-event. People were okay, and the first part of the move sort of prepared them for what was happening, and they had to rebase their MRs and stuff like that. It wasn't very disruptive at all. So
Okay.
hopefully, like for the actual move of the rest of the stuff that's under marketing, it won't be that disruptive. But as we've discussed, the really hard part of it is going to be, well, there's all this stuff in this issue, the preliminary stuff, which I think is pretty straightforward unless I run into some blockers, and that will make things in a cleaner state. But then there's this long comment I wrote. What was that on? It was on the monorepo refactor. You know, this essay here
Yeah.
about all of the various little nuances that I ran into, even just moving the handbook, which is fairly decoupled and isolated from the rest of the site. But now that we move the rest of it, we're going to run into lots of other things about, do we share it? Do we leave it up there? Do we do something in the middle? If we do something in the middle, then we have to basically make a case-by-case decision on everything, whether it should be shared or duplicated.
Yeah.
And those decisions, you know, may be easier in the short term, but make things harder in the long term as you try to move to a CMS and stuff. So some things we can, you know, kick down the road for later, but maybe they don't make sense to do that now. So that's sort of the crux of this big discussion here. Like, what do we move and what don't we, and how do we
Mm-hmm.
make those decisions? Which I don't have all the answers, but the first step was just like writing this brain dump of all of the things I knew we at
Yeah.
least had to think about. Cool.
Can we go over the monorepo YAML file? This seems like it's the center of where you define what files you're pulling down into each subsite.
Sure. Let's actually start at like how the middleman config works. So
Okay.
part of the plan of after this preliminary decoupling work is done is we're not going to have a top level build after this, because that
Okay.
effectively means like we still have to have a top level build that knows how to do everything that the subsites do, which doesn't
Yeah.
separate or isolate them at all. So
Yeah.
as long as the subsites work, and really the big blocker there now is like they just have to be able to have their assets in CSS, which is
Mm-hmm.
part of the work on here. So let's start at the config file. So I'll navigate to make it clear. If you look under sites, right, and there's the
Mm-hmm.
handbook, the blog, even though it's a subsite, it's like not a real one yet. It's not using the monorepo config. It's just sort of has the files, everything down here, and everything's symlinked, so the custom CI build will work. But the handbook, the stuff is actually moved, and you can see there's no symlink center here.
Yeah.
So if you look at its config.rb, it's split out into sections. So there's it starts with like, here's all the stuff that configures the monorepo, right? And then there's a bunch of stuff that has to be duplicated from the top level. That's what I was saying, like the top level build still has to be able to build a handbook currently because it's doing everything. So all of this stuff has to be kept duplicated. And then like here's the config that's actually specific to the handbook uh, subsite build, which in this case is just the proxy resources. And I use this trick here to just read the content of the Ruby file, an instance of it, so this can be shared. So these are like the proxy resources for the handbook site. So you can see, let me hang that up. If you look at the top level config here, um, you can see where it includes that same file in order to achieve the
Okay.
the main build being able to have all of the handbook's proxy resources.
Okay.
And this again is only specific to development mode. So that this is one of the reasons we want to get rid of this top level development build, because eventually everything in this file would have to be like shared from the config of the individual sites and
Yeah.
kept
You
in
don't
sync.
want
We
to do.
don't want to do that. So looking back here at the handbooks config, the crux of it is like this should really be belong in this section. I just haven't moved it. You say, okay, what's the root? And it's 2 levels up. And then this is used various other places. First of all, like just by making sure that anything that you try to require relative to the root is still going to work, because there's helpers and extensions and other things that
Mm-hmm.
tend to do that. And then these 2 middleman configs, the data directory, we're still sharing the data. So it's like, okay, your middleman data directory comes from the monorepo root, and this helpers dir, and just a little caveat, like we can't do this interpolation approach because reasons. And then here's the part you were asking about. So I originally had like evolved it to a bunch of commands that I had in here, and then refined it to an extension that can just be shared across the sites that does what it needs to do. And so that's what it's doing here, is activating the monorepo extension, and the one config that it has is setting the site name. So if we go into that, it's really similar to the other extension, like the way partial build does it, in
Mm-hmm.
one way, at least in terms of the manipulate resource list. It essentially says, okay, just figure out all the files I care about, which are all of the ones that are in the monorepo config under that path. So if you look at data monorepo YAML, the only path handbook cares about is that.
Mm-hmm.
So for example, like if we tried to do the same thing with the blog, because of like just the blog and not the marketing site, because of all of the files that you
Listed that it's pulled
yeah,
into.
I'm looking right, monorepo factor, blog, uh, separation blog. Right, this list that you came up with
Yeah.
here, like all of these things would have to be individually listed here under the paths, and it just gets crazy. And so ideally we're
Yeah.
just gonna have like site, we may have, this is a regex, so we'll probably just end up saying like not handbook maybe. We'll have to figure that out. So
Okay.
that's the first part of it. Like the start watching. Is so the manipulate resource list, that's a built-in hook to middleman. So just by the fact of this being an extension, this works. So we like read the sites, and if the path of the template in the source directory under source handbook source matches that, then we get it. And if you look under handbook source, it's like just this one. These other two things are things we've moved down that are only used by the handbook. So we were able to move those
Okay.
out of the top level directory because they're not shared. But the only thing we're building and serving up as a path is handbook, which, so that's why we have it here. Okay.
Yeah, and we're going to have a lot more paths in the marketing site.
And so
Okay.
the rest of what this does is this start watching method. And the whole point of this is this middleman API hook here is files watch. And what that's doing is saying, make this file available to the build for all of the paths that I'm trying to build from my resource list. And because most of the shared stuff that the handbook site needs still lives up here under the top level source, primarily under layouts and include, right? Layouts and
Mm-hmm.
includes. That's why we have to list all of them. So you can see here, this is just saying, okay, get all the shared files and make this files watch call for, it's essentially everything under source, but only the ones that you care about. Because
Okay.
the way it appears to work, if you include something in the files watch that is not used by any path that you actually serve, it ends up getting published. So like if we didn't have this
Oh, okay.
only, it would basically go ahead and publish everything under source because you're watching it. But it's like, oh, if you've watched it, but it's used by some other thing that is in my restricted resource list, then I'm not going to try to serve it up as a path.
Okay.
It seems to be the way it works, which is kind of weird. And I'm still a little bit vague on it, but that's the best I can explain it. And so you can see here, there's some notes at the top of this, of like specific ways I managed, and it explains what its paths are, the URL routes that are served by the site. And the shared files is an explicit allow list of its shared files. And we don't include everything to include performance and discourage adding them. I think part of the problem is like if you don't include stuff that you don't need, it can like blow up because it doesn't have dependency that it needs. So you sort of have to manually curate this whole dependency graph of stuff that is by whatever you have under paths.
Okay.
And that is just by running the build over and over. And you just to finish this at like these couple of notes, like every file that you add here, it should have a comment of where it's used from. The layouts are self-explanatory. They're layouts. But as far as these, they're like tools, or maybe they're referenced from a helper. Anything in the middleman build that ends up needing them, you have, and I've tried at least the first place I found that forced me to include it. It's changing if maybe we're like, oh yeah, we don't need that anymore, so it's deleted. And stepping back, obviously, the more work we do on either minimize the amount of stuff that's shared or do on, the more stuff we can delete from having main in this list. which is that's the point of the essay. If we leave everything shared, this is just a giant unmaintainable list. And if we duplicate things, that causes other problems because they get out of sync and people say, why isn't this in sync? It's all about .gitlab.com. Why do I have 3 files to change something that should be shared, right?
Yeah. Is it
That's the
going to
trade-off.
be possible to have a layouts folder at the root and then a layouts folder within each subsite?
So through these two tools, basically anything is possible. It's
Okay.
just the trade-offs are how big is this list versus how much do you want to duplicate, and then people are confused because they only change place, not everywhere we've duplicated it.
Okay.
Those are the two big questions, and that was the
Yeah.
all of the various flavors of that problem and decision.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because I could foresee us, using the same header footer, like main one, but we'll probably want different flavors of our header and footer for each subsite.
And then like the one note, like SVGs, sometimes they're served as partials, so they're actually templates. They're not images. Like they should be considered like pages more than images actually, if they're used that way. So where is it going to go? So that's the crux of what the monorepo extension and a monorepo will do. It's like everything in the paths, okay, that's what you're building. And everything that needs, okay, that's your shared files if it's still up at the top level. And it could be anywhere in the top level. Like for now, hard-coded being relative to source, but if we wanted to reorganize, we could put other stuff. But I'm saying for now, it doesn't really matter because this is a way to refer to it, and there's not really a reason to move it. It's still ultimately just going to be an entry in here, at least for the pages.
How about the monorepo migration helper?
Yeah, that's the other thing I was going to talk about. So coming up with this list, the first approach was like, hey, run the build, just go handbook sites and do bundle exec middleman build, wait for it to fire up all its stuff. And you can see for the hand specific one, there's a lot less stuff, so it's not as cool. But still, it's kind of more confusing if you let it do it in parallel because it'll blow up, but it will only blow up on one of the things that it built. But essentially, there's this iterative process of run the build, see what blows up, look at the message of what page was missing what file, put an entry in here, repeat, which is like as you get closer to the end of the build, like a 1, 2, 3, 4 minute iteration cycle, which is really freaking painful. And I personally just can't focus for that long. I'll just like squirrel. I can't stare at this.
Squirrel mode.
I can't not look at my phone or check my email or do something more productive than just stare and wait for the build to finish. And then it'll be like, oh, it's been finished for 5 minutes. So that's when I'm like, I'm going to write this to at least give me a start on it. So I follow the standard pattern I have here. Like I have under the scripts directory an executable file that only calls instantiate and calls a class. And the reason I use this is just because they're easier to test. Not that I wrote any tests for this, but if I wanted to, it's just an isolated class that doesn't execute itself when you try to load it like it would if you had it all in the same executable file. So I put a little bit of docs at the top. So tries to parse through, identify, for example, partials, layouts, throw away some stuff that obviously doesn't need to be there, and come out with at least a starter list of the stuff here that is not perfect, but maybe saves you several dozen of the iterations on running the build just to see what fails, because otherwise there's no way to know. And that's it. So what notes do I have here? Like which files are used outside of the site and need to be added to shared files, and which files are not used, and prints the git command to move them. So for example, here under source, like experiments and includes, those are only used by the handbook. There's no reason to leave them up at the top level as shared. Nothing else anywhere else in the site uses them outside of handbook, so those can be moved down. So that's the two things that spits out. The stuff that start on this list and whatever you can move down safely, not shared. And with the caveats, it's like you still have to move this multiple times, because you may move something and then it still has a reference to something else that you have to move. So that's why this duplicating things is easier, because this is like this graph of transitive dependencies that you're having to manually build up, which is a huge pain in the ass. So duplicating everything would just be easier, but not the best decision for everything. So but this thing runs in like a couple of seconds. So iterating by running this over and over is way less painful than like iterating on a 2-minute plus middleman build. And like I said, this doesn't catch anything. It doesn't catch everything. There's like, for example, some of the helpers, which are used by a template, but the helper still lives at the top level, and it includes the partial. It doesn't catch that. Maybe some other transitive dependencies, but it was a lot faster. And that's what I had used on the second iteration of trying to move the blog and the marketing before I gave up on that. And I forget what the final thing that convinced me was, but it's just like, no, this is just not going to work. We have to move everything.
Okay.
That answer your next question? Where are we at on the doc?
I think let's stop here for this walkthrough for the Monorepo. I think this is a really good starting point to share with the team so they can understand some of the files that are associated with it.
Yep. I know I repeated myself a lot, but hopefully that gets the points across.
Yeah. Thank you so much. And hold on, Chad.